Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. for the Maoist Third Worldist Collective. I wanted to talk about unions and unionization. That is a somewhat difficult subject for a variety of reasons. One, because there is such a tremendous variety of unions, and I personally am by no means familiar with all of them. I know about some, but not all. For example, I know about the union that I personally belong to. I know about the union that my father belonged to, but beyond that, not much. A little bit, but not much. Um, I'll tell you about my father's union. My father belonged to a union which was formerly called the Distributive Workers Union and was specifically called the District 65. District 65 was its name when it was part of the AFL-CIO. But even after it was no longer a member of the AFL-CIO, it still retains that designation. I don't know whether the AFL-CIO liked that very much, but they didn't do anything about it, and so it retained that title. Um, what happens with the Distributive Workers Union or District 65 is an interesting thing. An interesting case in point in unionization in the US. The AFL-CIO is a relatively conservative union, relatively conservative. I guess you'd call it moderate. I would not. I would call it conservative. Um, but regardless, back in the 1950s, during the Army McCarthy hearings, the famous Army McCarthy hearings, when people were dragged, literally dragged to testify before Congress. And why they agreed to do it, I have no idea. If they would have called me, I would have said no. I would have said, if you want me, come by, give me a police escort, arrest me, and bring me down to Congress. And then I will not say anything. I will take the fifth on every single question you ask me. In other words, I would not cooperate. Resistance is not futile, to misquote that statement from Star Trek. I would definitely resist. I would not want to be anywhere near Congress, especially not back in the 1950s. Um, but regardless, it seems as though a lot of people agreed to it for whatever reason, did not put up any resistance, went before Congress and testified freely. Many of them, as a result of that, were blacklisted. Now, why were people called before the Army McCarthy hearings? Well, Joseph McCarthy was a bit paranoid. Now, I'm not diagnosing him. I'm not saying he had paranoid personality disorder. I'm not qualified to say that. But in a very loose sense, he was paranoid. He was paranoid of communism. He thought that the communists were out to get us. For years, McCarthy and his committee put these people, innocent people, before the committee, defamed them, argued that they were secretly communists, the so-called secret communist conspiracy. Um, the idea that there are secret communists is absurd. Well, at least now it is. Maybe in the 50s it wasn't. But I am so open about being a communist. I mean, I wear communist t-shirts much of the time. So the idea of being a secret communist seems to me kind of ludicrous. But maybe there were some back then. I was not around. I was born in February of 1956, so I was too young to really understand what was happening with the Army McCarthy hearings. but they were going on nonetheless. Um, my father, for some reason, was never called to testify, even though he was a member of District 65. So, what is District 65? District 65, which no longer exists, it fell apart because it was taken over by a bunch of incompetent people who basically drove it into the ground and benefited from it financially. But originally, District 65, or the Distributive Workers Union, was the only communist union in New York. It may have been the only communist union in the United States, but I'm not sure about that. I know it was the only communist union in New York. And it was openly communist. It was friendly toward communists and communism. It had a very positive view, for example, of the former Soviet Union, of Cuba, and so on. My father loved District 65. He loved it. It was the center of his life. My father, like me, wasn't autistic. At home, he was not very sociable. He would often look like he was stupid, which he was not. You would ask him a question, he would often give you a blank stare in response. But amazingly, when I would go to visit him at District 65, which was located on Astor Place in Manhattan, his personality underwent a complete transformation. He was no longer my father. He was my father, but he wasn't the same person. He was friendly. He would joke around. He had a wonderful bedside manner as an optician. He was a really nice guy. And I kept on thinking to myself, where is this guy at home? What happens to him? He must be transformed when he gets onto the Long Island Railroad going home, or back when we lived in Queens, when he got onto the subway going home to Bayside, Queens. It made no sense. I could not make I could not make heads or tails out of it because he literally was an entirely different person at work. It was amazing just seeing that and seeing him at home. Literally two entirely different people occupying the same body. When the film Invasion of the Body Snatchers came out, I began thinking of my father, that somehow somebody must have snatched his body somewhere along the road and taken it over either when he got home or when he got to his office, one or the other, because it was completely um, nonsensical to believe that the two people, Harold Foster at work and Harold Foster at home, were the same person, and yet they were the same person. Very, very strange. So my father was no enemy of communism. Now, I do not know specifically what his views on communism were. When my father was alive, I did not know anything about the history of District 65. I did not know it was the only communist union in New York City. Um, Nothing about it. If I would have, obviously I would, since I was a commie, I would have raised the subject with him and tried to get some clarification on it. But I didn't know, and he never talked about it. Now, was my father a communist? Maybe. I guess I assume so, at least to a degree, somewhat. Sorry for making all these qualifications, but it's only because I never really discussed the subject with him, and I really have very little, if no information to go on. So I don't know what my father believed. But obviously, if my father loved the Distributed Workers Union, which was a communist union, my father was not opposed to communism. So, okay, so what happened? Well, in the 1950s, the AFL-CIO created a pledge, a written pledge, that it wanted all of its districts, its unions, it's like its sub-unions, to sign. My father's union, District 65, at that time of the AFL-CIO, refused to sign it. Yay. They refused to sign it. As a result, they were kicked out of the union. They were kicked out of the AFL-CIO. They still remained a union, but an independent union. In fact, District 65, for example, was the union which represented the Village Voice, among many other famous entities. It was a very big union in its time. I wish it was still around, but it's not. But it was a really, really good union in its time. And I guess aside from the Wobblies, and I'm not sure if I would call the Wobblies exactly communist. I think the Wobblies are more syndicalist than communist. Um, it was really the major leftist union in the United States. There were no major leftist unions in the US. Most unions had drifted pretty far to the right, at least pretty far to the right as far as I'm concerned. Now, bear in mind, I'm a revolutionary communist. So if you are not one, take what I'm saying with a grain of salt, because I am judging things based on that standard. But regardless, um, District 65 did not sign the petition. Good for them. And they were kicked out of the AFL-CIO. Thank you. Thank you, AFL-CIO, for kicking District 65 out. I'm actually very happy about that. They should have kicked them out because they were incompatible. I don't even know why District 65 agreed to be a part of the AFL-CIO to begin with, to be honest. Makes no sense to me. But it was a communist union, and my father was a proud member of it. My father was also a floor leader for the union. So my father, in addition to being an optician, also had the position of a floor leader or a floor director. I'm not sure exactly what that's called, uh, or the distinction. My knowledge of that is relatively vague. I believe that is a somewhat high position in the union. So he had that position in addition to actually working as an optician for the union. So, for example, if you were a member of the union, you could go to the District 65 building on Astor Place, literally right across the street from Cooper Union, if you've ever heard of Cooper Union, um, and get glasses at a discounted rate. Now, for us, meaning my father, his wife, my sister, myself, we paid nothing. We got glasses for free. Nice. We got glasses for free. Well, I still get glasses for free now, but that's because I have a really good supplementary Medicare plan. So literally, I pay nothing for eyeglasses, for prescriptions, for medical care, for hospitalization. I pay zero, zilch. But regardless, I love District 65. I would suggest Google it. Google District 65. Google the Distributive Workers Union, and you can read about it. You can read about the wonderful communist history of that union, my father's union. And hopefully you will be maybe not as pleased as me, but at least pleased. I'm pleased because it was my father, and he was a floor leader in that union. Okay, so regardless, that's one union, but that union, my father's union, was an exception. Most unions were not like District 65 at all. As I said, they were relatively right wing, some pretty far to the right, maybe some more moderate, but to me, moderate is still right wing. That's me. Now, my uncle, who's also deceased, his name was Ralph Lawrence Kleinman. Interestingly, my father was Harold Lawrence Feigenbaum until he changed his last name to Foster, which is why I'm Mark Foster, not Mark Feigenbaum. It's kind of an interesting coincidence considering that they're not related. I mean, my uncle Ralph is on my mother's side, not on my father's side, but in any event, my uncle Ralph was a communist organizer in New York City. Now, I wish I would have asked my uncle, Ralph, what type of communism were you involved in? What tendency? I don't know why it never occurred to me to ask him that. I don't know why. In retrospect, I've tried to figure out why, but for some reason, it simply never crossed my mind because I'm a fool. Maybe not, but at least in that case, I was a fool because I really should have asked him that question. So I don't know what tendency in communism my uncle Ralph was in, but I know he was a communist. I know my father was like me, involved in the New Left, but he was involved in it in its early stages. I was involved in it in its late stages. So I saw the New Left as it was deteriorating. My uncle Ralph saw it as it was initiating. So we could have had two different perspectives on the New Left, but we never talked about that either. So whatever. I don't understand it, but so be it. But at least I can say that I have two members of my family, my first uncle and my father, who are or perhaps were communists. My uncle I know was. My father I think was, but I can't prove it, you know? I mean, he was the floor leader for a communist union. That seems pretty good evidence to me, but as a sociologist, as somebody who believes in empiricism, I would need to have more evidence before I would make a statement definitively saying that my father was really a communist, because I don't have that evidence. Now, is it a good thing for communists to join unions? That is a complex question. What I would say is that if you live in a so-called open shop state, and where I lived in Kansas when I worked as professor of sociology, I was living in an open shop state. That meant that there was no way that the union could force employees to join. Now, that may sound good, but it's not good. At least if you care about workers, it's not good. Because what that means is that the union has very little bargaining power. When it goes before the board of directors or the board of trustees, it doesn't have the ability to say, we represent all the workers, because they don't. It turned out that where I worked, at the college where I worked, only about half of all faculty belonged to the union. And by the union, I mean the largest union in the United States, National Education Association, the NEA, a huge union. And although it's not exactly left wing, I guess you could call it progressive, which is better than nothing, maybe. I don't know. But although I could have chosen not to join it, I decided, what the heck? I want to support my union. So even though my union was not a communist union, there are no communist unions anymore in the US, I joined it anyway. So I was a member of the NEA, and I am now a lifetime member of the NEA. It cost me $450. Why did I pay $450? I did. But now I'm a lifetime member of the NEA, and they can't take that away from me. I will always be a member of that union. There are some people in the NEA who don't like thinking of the NEA as a union. They say, no, we are a professional organization. Well, huddy da da, you know? It's like, why would you care, you know? It's like, I'm better than thou, you know? I'm better than thou. How dare you equate me with being a member of a mere union? But so there are some people who don't like the title union being associated with the NEA, but regardless of what they like, for all intents and purposes, it is a union. It functions as a union. So I see no reason why people should not agree and simply give up the fight and call it what it is, a union. Now, so I joined the NEA and became a lifetime member of the NEA after I retired because of the fact that I wanted to support something that was at least somewhat to the left. I realize it's not communist, and that's why I honestly had reservations about becoming a lifetime member. I even had reservations about joining it in the first place because I didn't have to. It was no Kansas was an open shop state and still is. But what the heck? Why not join it? Why not join it? Now, closed shop states are better, like New York State, where I was born and raised, because that way a union can say, if you want to work here, then you have to be a member of the union. And again, that gives the union more bargaining power. Um, and in some states, like in New York, the NEA chapter has that kind of bargaining power. We had some bargaining power, meaning we negotiated salaries and benefits with the Board of Trustees. But that was only because the Board of Trustees agreed to let us do that. If they wanted to, they could have said no. And there was nothing at all that we could do to fight that because it's an open shop state. Open shop states are not nice if you like unionization. Generally, so-called red states, states which are predominantly Republican, are open shop states. So-called blue states, states which are predominantly Democrat, are closed shop states. That's the history of the way in which unionization has generally worked in the United States. Be that as it may, unions are nowhere near as powerful as they used to be. Unions used to be really, really powerful. I mean, really powerful. If a union boss said something, that meant something. Does it mean something now? Not really. And that's a shame. To me, that's a real damn shame. Because unions represent the workers. If you want to see a movie about unionization and the importance of unionization, I would strongly suggest that you watch Norma Ray, starring Sally Field. It's a wonderful movie, and it gives you a taste of how it's a real life story. It's not fiction about how this woman, what became an unwilling union champion where she worked, and pioneered unionization in the US. She was a genuine hero for anybody who loves unions. And admittedly, even though I know unions are deficient, they're not perfect, I love unions. I don't love unions enough to be a syndicalist. I don't really care much for syndicalism. In fact, some varieties of syndicalism are actually fascist, and those I really don't like at all. But even those forms of syndicalism which are to the left, I'm not a big fan of it. It just doesn't really do anything for me. But when it comes to unions themselves, aside from syndicalism, I think it's a good idea to belong to one, and that if you do not belong to one, if there is one where you work, to join it, to support it, and to try to make it better. This has been Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Maoist Third Worldist Collective. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.